All right. So after Stefan, our next speaker is Eline Smit. She is currently a PhD student at the Marks Institute of Brain Behavior and Development at Sydney University in Sydney, Australia. Eline's PhD research focuses on the perception of effect of unfamiliar musical systems. She completed her Bachelor of Arts in Arts and Humanities with great distinction, magna cum laude, at the University of Utrecht, the Netherlands, and her Masters of Art in Musicology at the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands again. She also studied classical piano at the Royal Conservatoire in Antwerp, where she received her Bachelor of Art with distinction, cum laude. Eline holds a Marks Institute PhD scholarship and was recently awarded a transdisciplinary and innovation grant from the ARC Center of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language to study the impact of music on implicit word training. Thanks a lot, Eline. So I leave this to you now.
Thanks, Amir, for the introduction. I was going to introduce myself, but that's not necessary anymore. Good evening, everyone from Sydney. And I'll start my screen share. This always takes a while, so bear with me, please. Okay, I hope everyone can see this. Okay, so as Amir already said, I'm a third-year PhD student at the Marks Institute, originally from the Netherlands, but moved to Sydney 3 years ago to do my PhD and to enjoy the sunshine. And the experiment I will talk about today is a cross-cultural experiment looking at affect perception of Western musical harmony, and it was conducted in a remote area of Papua New Guinea. So I'll start with a little bit of background, but I'll try to keep it short because there is a lot to tell in those 15 minutes. Music is an essential part of most cultures, and music has a strong impact on our emotions. However, how music affects our emotions and to which extent is universal is a large debate. An important discussion within this debate is whether our emotional responses to music are associated with specific psychoacoustic features in the music itself, or whether it's due to familiarity and long-term exposure to culture-specific musical structures. And examples of such psychoacoustic features are roughness, harmonicity, and the focus of today, mean pitch. So for example, higher mean pitch has been found to be associated with happy effect, whereas a lower mean pitch has been associated with sad effect. And apart from those psychoacoustic features, there are also some culture-specific factors that have an effect on our perception of emotion in music, such as familiarity with the structure of the music used in the culture, for example, violations with common musical structures that may lead to a negative effect, or familiarity with common associations between musical features and emotions in a culture. For example, a major harmony is often associated with happy events and a minor harmony with sad events. And I just saw some messages in the chat box. I'm not sure if that means that people cannot hear me, but I'll just go on. Yeah, so there's a lot of contradiction in the current state of research on which of these mechanisms or processes are more important, whether it's the innate acoustic features or culture-specific mechanisms. And in order to answer this question, studies have often resorted to using Western musical stimuli to test Western enculturated participants. And there's only a handful of studies who've tested the relationship between music and emotion using participants from remote areas with limited exposure to Western music. And therefore, it is still relatively unknown how variations in familiarity with Western music and its culture lead to different emotional responses to music. We were lucky to be able to go on a field trip to Papua New Guinea to study the effective responses to Western musical harmony in a remote community in the Urawa River Valley in the Morobe province in Papua New Guinea. And I'll just quickly show you where it is. So the blue dot is where I am now, not you guys, but where I am. So that's Sydney. And Papua New Guinea is in the middle, and the area where we went to will always be in the middle of the image. So I'll just quickly zoom in. Okay, there you see the river running through the picture. And now we zoom in on the village. So this is the village where we stayed and did our experiments. And this is the Ura River Valley. And I'll give you a little bit of background on the valley. This village called Toet is the one where we stayed. And these are some neighboring villages that are still quite a walk away. But we also tested some participants there. So the Ura River Valley is a remote cloud rainforest area in the Morobe province. And it has a lot of differences in elevation that ranges from sea level to peaks of 4,000 meters. This means that there's hardly any level ground, and people live, move, and cultivate their crops on steep vertical slopes. And due to this difficult terrain, the area has had little influence from outside, or relatively little. So currently the valley is still quite isolated. It's only possible to get there from plane. Let's see. Quickly see the chat. Okay, nothing wrong. All right, good. Villages lead a pretty self-sufficient life, traditional life. They have no electricity unless there are solar panels installed, but those are brought in from outside. And there's little mobile phone coverage. Historically, the area has had several streams of Western involvement, and this has mainly been through missionary activities of the Lutheran and the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or the SDA. And due to this missionary involvement, most villages have now adopted either the Lutheran or the SDA Church. And this is important to know because the followers of the SDA Church will sing a selection of Western hymns during their services, whereas followers of the Lutheran Church mainly use their own traditional songs and melodies. And sometimes these are adopted to Western melodies, but this is a little bit unclear. And these melodies are possibly accompanied by guitar, but we're a bit unsure about that because we weren't able to go to those services. But even though it's still quite isolated, there's a little bit of Western influence in the area. So we conducted a forced choice listening experiment, and we tested pairs of intervals, triads, cadences, and melodies. And the question we asked the participants is whether something sounded finished or not finished, or whether it sounded heavy. These questions were decided upon in collaboration with our collaborator, Dr. Hanna Savasi, who is a linguist and fluent speaker of the local Nuang language. And it's a bit difficult to decide which question you ask in a situation like this, as participants are not necessarily used to rate things in a static way. For example, this language group is not used to rating things on a scale, so a Likert scale wouldn't be possible to use. You have to find something that fits their culture and habits. And in collaboration with Hanna Savasi, we decided that finished, not finished, and happy, sad were two options that we could use. So finished, not finished represents stability or consonance ratings, and happy and sad represents failures. We used finished, not finished for the intervals and triads, and happy, sad for cadences and melodies. And today I will just talk about the cadences, because otherwise it's going to take too long. And yeah, so the overall aim of the experiment was to test whether participants from Papua New Guinea will make similar responses as to Westerners. And if they don't do this, this might suggest that musical pitch and harmony communicate purely through cultural learning. But if they do make the same assessments, this might suggest that there might be some musical universals. And we'll test whether pitch height, roughness, spectral entropy, and harmonicity can predict these universals. The aim for today is just to look at cadences, and especially whether modes, so major or minor cadence, predict happy and sad responses, or whether mean pitch predicts happy or sad responses. So we tested 88 participants in the village where we stayed in Toet, and the majority of them have some familiarity with Western music through the church attendance, but not necessarily with conventional associations between musical features and affect. For example, they might sing hymns in a major key, but they wouldn't necessarily associate that with a happy feeling. And 82 participants tested in other villages who might be less familiar with Western music, because they go to the different church, or they mostly go to the different church. And then we also tested 60 non-musician participants in Sydney and 19 musician participants in Sydney as well. So we have a whole range of musical abilities and familiarity with Western music. Okay, so this is an example of what a cadence trial would look like. So they would hear one cadence preceded by the word inguk, which is the local language word for one. And then a second cadence preceded by the word yö, which is the local language for two. And then they would be asked which one of these pieces of music is the happy one, number one or number two. And half of the cadences had only major chords and half only minor chords. And they were played in 3 different keys to have a bit of variety with mean pitch. And we would expect Western listeners to typically consider the major cadences to be happier than the minor cadences. And the question is, will the P&D participants make the same assessment? So I will just play an example, but I'm not sure if I shared the computer audio, so I'm not sure if it's going to work.
Inguk. Yoi.
Okay, so in case that didn't work, you heard a major cadence first and a minor cadence second. So you would rate the first cadence as the happy one, generally. Okay, and then to the next slide. And then afterwards, we asked the participants a few questions to assess their familiarity with Western and other types of music, and some general demographics. We used Bayesian multi-level logistic regression to analyze the data and to analyze the probability that the second cadence is the happier one. And in the model, we included the effect of mean pitch, and we removed pattern data, which means that if participants only responded 1, 1, 1, 1, or 2, 2, 2, or 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, we excluded them because that might be an indication that they didn't understand the task. Now we split the participants into 5 groups based on their geographic location, which has a bit to do with the linguistic profile of those villages, as well as their culture and the churches they went to. And then Sydney musicians and non-musicians. Okay, so this is the model output, and we can see that there we have a main effect of whether the mode of the second cadence is minor, and a main effect of a mean pitch, and we'll go a bit more into detail about that now. So first we'll have a quick look at the responses of the 2 Sydney groups. So what we would expect is for a typical Western response that if the first cadence is minor and the second is major, that the probability of the second major being chosen as the happy one should be higher than the probability of the second cadence being chosen as the happy one when that is minor and the first one is major. And we see that this is the case for both Sydney groups, so that's good, and that's what we expect. When we run a hypothesis test on this, we get very strong evidence that this is the case. So this is all according to expectation. And then when we do the same with the Papua New Guinea groups, we get very strong evidence for that as well for a participant group consisting of participants from the Bembe, Mi'kmaq, and Moop villages, and strong evidence for the other 2 groups. So this suggests that they respond similarly as the Westerners, but the strength of the response may differ per village group. So that is quite interesting. And when we go to mean pitch, if we look at Western responses from prior studies, including some of my own, we expect a higher average pitch to lead to a higher effective rating. So happy is high and sad is lower. And this is indeed what we find for both the non-musicians as the musicians as well. And we have very strong evidence for that in hypothesis testing. And for P&G, we have a similar thing as for the mode, that for the third group, we have very strong evidence that their response is the same as as the Westerners. But for the first 2 groups, or for the first group, we only have moderate evidence, and for the second one, we have no evidence that they respond the same. So this suggests that the impact of mean pitch on effective responses might be partially culturally learned, or that there's something different going on between those villages, but I'm not sure yet. Yeah, so the aim for today was to test whether major or minor mode in the cadence can predict happy or sad responses, and whether the mean pitch can predict happy or sad responses. And we find that we have very strong evidence that this is the case for, well, Western participants, but also for the third PNG group, so people from Bembe, Mik, and Mu, and partially for the other villages as well. But there's something seems to be different about this village group that makes them respond more like Westerners than the others. But we'll have to look a bit more into detail about that, because we don't have that much background about those villages. They go to the different churches that we weren't able to visit, so perhaps they have heard more guitar music than the other villages, or maybe they've had more exposure to Western music. That's all a little bit speculative for now. Yeah, so what's next? So we'll have to look more into the musical background of those villages. We also plan to incorporate age in the models, because there's been quite a shift in the last couple of years in that area, and that prior to a certain time, there was less Western involvement than nowadays. So we'll have to see whether the age of participants has an impact on the responses as well, because older people might be more traditional than the younger people. We also like to compare it with the previous studies using microtonal systems, which I'm doing a PhD. And the results from today show that it's important to test different levels of familiarity with Western music, because it can have an impact on our emotional responses to music. And we also like to include the other predictors for later analysis, so roughness, harmonicity, spectroentropy, etc. And that is all for today. We pre-registered this experiment, and you can find it at the following link. And I'd like to thank my supervisor, Amir-Homayoun, and Javadi for organizing the field trip, and the Marx Institute for sponsoring all of this. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That was a really interesting talk, and what an amazing piece of research to be able to go to these villages and do that kind of research. That I'm quite jealous. But so we have a couple of questions coming in. A couple of people were kind of interested in whether you got any kind of more insight into the musical traditions of the different villages, and whether you think having those different traditions would make a difference, and maybe that could be why you had different results between the studies, because they have different traditions.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we were staying in one particular village, and we were able to witness a little bit of the local music that they used to play. But the thing is with the SDA church, which is the Western type church, is that they don't really allow much for the traditional music to be played in the villages. So it's a bit tricky to get people to play it for you. And some of the villages we weren't able to visit. So we had local research assistants testing there for us. So as Westerners, it's a bit tricky because those villages that you can visit are usually also the ones that have adopted the most Western traditions, and the ones that you would like to see are the ones that are still the more protected, and it's well, maybe even dangerous to go there. So we're trying to get more detail about that, because that's definitely very important for explaining the results as well. But I can't really give an answer to that now.
It's understandable reasons as to why you can't do that. So we had a couple about the stimuli as well, and whether you've tried other musical instruments, for instance, like guitars, which might be more of a Western instrument, and maybe that could be influencing results as well, the type of instruments that's used in your stimuli. Yeah,
so I didn't mention this, but we used two different timbres. So we had the vocal timbres, as you all heard, and a string ensemble as well. We're still looking into that, but so far it didn't really seem to have a big impact on results.
Okay. So kind of some general questions as well have come in, and just kind of your opinion. Why do you think music has such a big influence across different cultures, and that it's even spread to like these kind of remote cultures? It might be something that you can't answer as much, but the question out there.
Oh, that's a big question, isn't it? Yeah, I think that probably all comes down to why do we have music and what's the evolutionary purpose of music. I think, especially in the current situation, I think we all start to understand the need that people have for music, and the need to express ourselves through music, and what is it called, the communal aspect that music has. So we can share our experiences and our emotions together through music, and it's a big part of the way we communicate with each other. Yeah, I think that's probably a big reason why we have music, but I don't think there is a consensus yet on the specific origins and reasons why we have music.
Yeah. So we have a few more on, somebody's asked whether you did any collaboration with ethnomusicologists, or whether this might be something that you're looking into doing, or could you?
We don't have it yet, but that would definitely be interesting, because there's we're trying to get a few recordings as well from the villages, and it would also be very interesting to just analyze the music itself. And there's a lot of different perspectives that we can that we can use in this study. Yeah.
Okay, so we have one here is about the fact that you've mentioned that quite a lot of the villagers' interaction with Western music is through the church, and whether you think that kind of social and religious, or more connecting aspect of that could influence your results in any way.
Yeah, that certainly has an impact. Especially, I think, for the followers of the SDA Church, because they do sing Western hymns. But it's difficult. We can't really generalize this across villages or across communities, because they're all very isolated from each other as well. And this shows, for example, in the linguistic profile of all the villages, that a neighboring village can have a completely different language because they don't come across each other. So the impact that the church might have on the village that we tested in, it might be different for a different village. And then if they have adopted the Lutheran church, then there's a whole bunch of different rules and traditions that come with that as well. So it's difficult to generalize, but it will certainly have an impact, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So somebody's asked as well whether you were surprised that the music actually had quite a similar effect between the Papua New Guinea and the Sydney more Western participants, and what do you think that actually shows about the relationships between like musical features and emotions?
I think that there's definitely musical features that might function on a universal level. But again, because we're not entirely sure yet what the impact is of the church on the responses, it's difficult to say whether they are indeed universal or whether it's all due to their familiarity with the hymn. So we have to be a bit careful with saying that. Yeah, I think that there are definitely, well, my opinion is that there should be things that are universal. Yeah.
Yeah. So somebody's just asked in general how you went about approaching your sample, especially the Papua New Guinea, and how you went about stuff like translating the kind of scales. You mentioned earlier that you had to use the forced choice because they don't use Likert scales. Just a bit more about how you went about that process, and especially things like ethics and informed consent.
Yeah. So we had my collaborator, sorry, I mentioned Hannah Savasi. She has done linguistic research in this village and these communities for a couple of years already. So she's been there a couple of times. She speaks the language fluently. There's a couple of people in the village that speak English as well. So they helped us with our research and they translated accordingly. And she also, all the information sheets and the consent forms were translated before we went there. So that was all relatively easy. Of course, with ethics, that is quite a procedure, and it was not just us going there that it's not just the ethics of the participants that we were concerned with, but also with the safety for ourselves. But because Hannah has already been there and has relationships with that village, it was a bit easier for us to go there as well. So yeah, there's a whole process that goes into that.
Yeah. So there's kind of adding to that, there's a question about whether the fact that you had to use a forced response between these two options, whether you think that could influence the results. And did you use the forced response in the Sydney participants as well? And whether, because they're more familiar with Likert scales, whether that would impact the results in that population compared to the Papua New Guinea one?
So we used the exact same test for the Sydney participants as for the Papua New Guinea participants, including the Inguk and the beforehand, but we explained that that was part of that experiment. Yeah, ideally you would use something or like continuous rating. I mean, there every type of self-report response that you use has pros and cons. In this case, this was the best way to get a response of those participants that would be an accurate reflection of what they meant. Yeah, because in their language as well, what we noticed while we were there is that things are quite black or white. So they don't have something that's a little bit beautiful, but then a bit more beautiful, and then extremely beautiful, or very happy, less happy. They don't describe things like that. So for this population group, this was the best way to approach it.
That's a really good answer. So I think we have time for one more. And somebody has kind of said really interesting research, and thanks to you. And they've asked whether would collecting music that the participants themselves thought to be happy or sad, especially if, as you just said, they have such extreme responses. Do you reckon that would enlighten further this kind of evidence and correlation that you're seeing, and whether that would show a difference in the universality of the results?
Definitely, this is something that I wanted to do initially as well, but we were quite short on time while we were there, so we just tried to do as many things as possible. But yeah, if there's an opportunity to go back, that's definitely something that's on my list to include as well. Yeah. Great.
I think that is it. Thank you so much, Eline, and for joining us all the way from Sydney as well. Have a great evening there. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.